The cabin sat at the edge of the clearing, and everyone who passed it had the same reaction. They stared at the chimney, shook their heads, and wondered what kind of fool would build something so ugly. The thing looked wrong. Where every other cabin in the Wyoming Territory had a neat, straight chimney rising from one end, this cabin had a monstrosity. A massive, bulging structure of stone that dominated the interior, with a chimney that bent and twisted like a drunk man's path home. Neighbors called it wasteful. They called it the ugliest thing they'd ever seen. Some said the man who built it didn't know the first thing about construction. Others said he was trying to show off, building something complicated just to prove he was smarter than everyone else. Either way, they agreed on one thing. That chimney was a mistake. The man who built it was named Henrik Larsson. He arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1876, a Swedish immigrant who'd spent 5 years working in the iron foundries of Pennsylvania before heading west. He was 38 years old, quiet, methodical, and he had ideas about heat that nobody else seemed to understand. Ideas that came from watching molten iron flow through furnaces, from understanding how hot air moved, how stone absorbed and released energy, how the path of smoke could be controlled to extract every possible bit of warmth before it escaped into the sky. When Henrik filed his homestead claim in the spring of 1876, he spent the entire summer not building his cabin, but studying. He watched how smoke rose from his campfire. He observed how heat radiated from sun-warmed rocks. He paid attention to how the wind moved through the valley, how cold air settled in low places at night, how the angle of the sun changed with the seasons. His neighbors thought he was lazy. They thought he was wasting time. They'd already built their cabins and started breaking ground for crops while Henrik was still living in a tent, watching smoke and taking notes. But Henrik wasn't lazy. He was planning. He was designing. And what he was designing would change how people thought about heating their homes in the brutal Wyoming winters. The standard chimney design in 1876 was simple. A fireplace built against one wall, usually the north or east wall. A straight chimney rising from that fireplace, going directly up and out through the roof. The design worked. Smoke left the cabin. The fireplace provided heat. It was proven, traditional, and everyone built them that way. Henrik looked at that design and saw waste, massive, inexcusable waste. He calculated that in a standard cabin with a standard chimney, roughly 70% of the heat generated by the fire went straight up the chimney and out of the cabin. Only 30% actually warmed the living space. The smoke, carrying enormous amounts of thermal energy, rushed up the flue so fast it had no time to transfer that heat to anything useful. It was gone in seconds, wasted into the cold Wyoming air. In the foundries where Henrik had worked, they understood heat extraction. They understood that hot gases moving through metal or stone would transfer their energy to those materials. The longer the hot gases stayed in contact with a heat-absorbing surface, the more energy could be captured. Foundry operators designed complex flue systems that twisted and turned, forcing hot exhaust gases to travel long distances through stone or metal channels, extracting every possible bit of heat before releasing the gases to the atmosphere. The principle was simple. Don't let heat escape until you've stolen every bit of it you can. Henrik decided to apply that principle to his cabin chimney. Instead of a straight flue that let smoke and heat escape immediately, he would build a chimney with a long, winding path. The smoke would have to travel through channels built into a massive stone structure that sat in the center of the cabin. As the smoke traveled through these channels, it would heat the stone. The stone would store that heat and radiate it into the cabin for hours after the fire died down. It was a thermal battery, a heat storage system built right into the structure of the chimney itself. The design he sketched out was radical. The firebox would sit low, close to the floor on the north side of the cabin's interior. From there, the smoke would rise into a chamber, then be forced to travel horizontally through a channel that ran along the base of a massive stone wall. After traveling about 8 feet horizontally, the smoke would rise again into a second chamber, then travel horizontally in the opposite direction through another channel. This serpentine path would repeat 3 more times, forcing the smoke to travel nearly 40 feet through stone channels before finally exiting through a chimney that emerged from the center of the cabin's roof. The entire structure would be built from thousands of stones, carefully selected, fitted, and mortared. The mass would be enormous, probably 6 or 7 tons of stone sitting in the middle of the cabin. The channels would be precisely sized, too large and the smoke would move too quickly, not transferring enough heat, too small and the chimney would not draw properly, filling the cabin with smoke. The bends and turns would need to be carefully designed to allow smoke to flow while maximizing heat transfer. It was engineering, not just building. When Henrik finally started construction in late July, his neighbors came to watch. What they saw confirmed their worst suspicions. This man was building something that made no sense. He started by creating a massive stone foundation in the center of where his cabin would be. Not at the edge, not against a wall, but right in the center. He hauled stones from the creek bed and from rocky outcroppings on his land. Hundreds of stones, thousands of stones. He sorted them carefully by size and shape. He chipped and shaped them to fit together tightly. The work was slow, meticulous, and completely baffling to everyone watching. A neighbor named Jacob Miller, whose claim adjoined Henrik's to the west, finally asked what he was doing. Henrik, never one to waste words, said, "Building a stove." Miller looked at the growing mass of stone, already 4 feet tall and 6 feet across. "That's not a stove," he said. "That's a monument. You building a cabin or a church?" Henrik just kept working, setting another stone, checking it with his level, tapping it into place. Miller tried again. "A fireplace should be on the wall. Everyone knows that. You put it in the middle, you waste all that floor space. Can't put your bed against it, can't set up your workspace against it, just takes up room." "It will give heat," Henrik said, "all around, not just one side." Miller shook his head. "Fires give heat. Don't matter where you put them. You're making extra work for yourself, and you're going to end up with a cabin that looks ridiculous." Henrik didn't argue. He just kept building. By mid-August, the stone mass had grown to 8 feet tall and began to take its distinctive shape. The serpentine channels inside were carefully constructed, lined with specially selected flat stones that would withstand heat without cracking. The channels were about 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall, sized to allow smoke to flow while maintaining contact with the maximum surface area of stone. The bends were gentle curves, not sharp corners, to prevent smoke from backing up. From the outside, all anyone could see was this bulging, irregular mass of stone rising from the center of the cabin floor. It didn't look like any chimney they'd ever seen. It was too wide, too irregular, with bulges and lumps where the internal chambers sat. It looked like someone who didn't know how to build a chimney had just piled stones together, hoping for the best. The ugliness was structural. To maximize heat transfer, Henrik had prioritized function over form. The bulges housed the internal chambers where smoke would pool briefly before moving to the next section. The irregular surface area meant more stone exposed to the cabin's interior, more surface to radiate heat. Every ugly bump and lump served a purpose, but nobody else could see that purpose. They just saw ugly. The actual firebox, when Henrik finally built it in early September, was surprisingly small, just 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. His neighbors laughed. After all that work, all that massive stone, the actual place you put wood was tiny. How were you supposed to heat a cabin with a firebox that couldn't even hold 3 logs? Henrik had an answer, but he didn't bother sharing it. The small firebox was intentional. A small, hot fire was more efficient than a large, cool fire. A small firebox would burn wood completely, extracting maximum heat from every log. The key wasn't fire size, it was heat capture, and his chimney was designed to capture nearly everything the fire produced. By late September, Henrik had finally finished his cabin. The walls were up, solid log construction with careful chinking. The roof was completed, sod covered for insulation. And in the center of the single room, dominating everything, sat the massive, ugly stone chimney. The structure took up nearly a quarter of the cabin's interior space. You couldn't ignore it. You had to walk around it. It made the cabin feel smaller, more cramped, and it looked absolutely terrible. When Jacob Miller saw the completed cabin, he brought other neighbors to look. They stood inside, staring at the monstrosity Henrik had created. The chimney was so large you could barely see around it. The stonework, while technically sound, was rough and utilitarian. The bulges and irregularities made it look like a child's attempt at building. The chimney stack that finally emerged through the roof was off-center, rising from the middle of the cabin instead of from a gable end like every proper cabin chimney should. "Henrik," Miller said slowly, "I think you may have made a mistake." Henrik was arranging his few possessions in the cabin, setting up his bed, his small table, his cooking gear. He didn't look up. "Works fine." "How do you know? You haven't even lit a fire in it yet." "It will work." Miller exchanged glances with the other neighbors. There was pity in their eyes now, mixed with the amusement. This poor fool had spent his entire summer building something that wouldn't work, wasting time and effort on a chimney design that made no sense. They'd tried to tell him, they'd tried to help. Now he'd have to live with the consequences. The first test came 2 days later when Henrik lit his first fire. He'd prepared carefully, making sure the flue was clear, that all the channels were properly constructed, that the chimney would draw. He built a small fire of kindling and small sticks, just enough to warm the chimney and establish draft. The smoke rose from the firebox, entered the first chamber, and disappeared into the horizontal channel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, steady and strong, smoke began rising from the chimney stack on the roof. The draw was perfect. Not a wisp of smoke entered the cabin. Every bit went exactly where Henrik had designed it to go. He fed the fire slowly, adding larger pieces of wood, building the heat gradually. Within 30 minutes, the firebox was burning hot, consuming wood completely, leaving almost no smoke, just shimmering heat, rising into the stone structure. Henrik sat at his table, eating his dinner, watching the stone mass. After about an hour, he stood and walked to the chimney. He placed his hand on the stone surface on one of the bulges near the base. The stone was warm, not hot enough to burn, but distinctly, noticeably warm. He moved around the structure, checking different locations. Every surface was warming up. The entire mass was becoming a radiator. As the evening progressed, Henrik added wood to the fire every 30 minutes or so, small amounts, keeping the fire steady and hot. The cabin began to warm, but it wasn't just the radiant heat from the firebox that warmed the space. It was the stone mass itself. Heat radiated from every surface of the chimney, spreading warmth in all directions. By the time Henrik let the fire die down to coals around 9 o'clock that night, the cabin was comfortably warm. Actually warm, not just tolerable. Warm enough that he didn't need his heavy coat. Warm enough that he could sit and read by lamplight without his fingers going numb. The real test came later that night. Henrik went to bed around 10 o'clock. He let the fire go completely out, nothing but cold ashes in the firebox. In a normal cabin with a standard chimney, the temperature would drop rapidly once the fire went out. Within an hour, the interior would be nearly as cold as the outside. But in Henrik's cabin, something different happened. The stone mass, now thoroughly heated from hours of smoke, traveling through its channels, continued radiating warmth. The temperature dropped, certainly, but it dropped slowly, very slowly. When Henrik woke at dawn, the cabin was still noticeably warmer than the outside air. The stone was still warm to the touch. The heat stored in those tons of stone had sustained the cabin through the entire night. Over the next few weeks, Henrik refined his technique. He learned exactly how much wood to burn and for how long to keep the cabin comfortable. He discovered that 3 hours of steady burning in the evening was enough to keep the cabin warm through the night and into the morning. Where his neighbors were waking up multiple times to feed their fires, burning wood constantly to maintain heat, Henrik burned wood for 3 hours and then slept peacefully while his stone battery did the work. The efficiency was remarkable. Henrik calculated he was using less than half the firewood his neighbors required. His small firebox burned wood completely, extracting maximum heat. His serpentine chimney captured that heat and stored it in stone. His massive thermal mass released that stored heat slowly over many hours. The system worked exactly as he'd designed it to work, but his neighbors didn't know any of this yet. They just saw Henrik's ugly chimney and assumed he was suffering through a poorly designed cabin, too proud to admit his mistake. The real revelation came in late October when the first serious cold snap hit Wyoming Territory. Temperatures dropped below zero for 3 nights in a row. The wind howled across the open prairie, finding every crack and gap in cabin walls. In standard cabins with standard chimneys, families huddled close to their fireplaces, burning wood as fast as they could cut it, trying desperately to stay warm. The fires roared constantly, consuming cords of precious firewood, yet the cabins remained cold. The moment you stepped away from the immediate area of the fireplace, the cold closed in. Jacob Miller's cabin was typical. His fireplace burned constantly, a large, hot fire consuming split logs at an alarming rate. The area directly in front of the fireplace was warm, almost too warm. But the rest of the cabin was frigid. The north wall, opposite the fireplace, actually had frost forming on the inside. Miller's wife and children slept, piled together under every blanket they owned, still shivering. Miller himself woke every 2 hours to feed the fire, exhausted and frustrated. They were burning firewood at an unsustainable rate, and winter had barely started. On the 3rd morning of the cold snap, Miller made his way to Henrik's cabin to check on his neighbor. He expected to find Henrik in bad shape, probably regretting his foolish chimney design, maybe even ready to ask for help. What he found shocked him. Henrik answered the door in his shirt sleeves. Not a coat, not a heavy wool shirt, just a regular cotton shirt, and he looked comfortable. Miller stood outside in the brutal cold, bundled in his heaviest clothes, staring at Henrik in his shirt sleeves. "Can I come in?" Miller asked. Henrik stepped aside. Miller entered the cabin and stopped. The warmth hit him immediately. Real warmth, comfortable warmth, the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in his own cabin in 3 days. He looked around. There was no fire burning. The firebox was cold, yet the cabin was warm. Miller walked to the ugly stone chimney and placed his hand on it. The stone was warm. Not slightly warm, noticeably, distinctly warm. Heat radiated from every surface. "How?" Miller asked. Henrik explained. He explained about heat capture, about the long path the smoke traveled, about thermal mass and slow release. He explained how 3 hours of fire in the evening charged the stone, and the stone released that heat slowly through the night. He explained how his system used half the wood to produce twice the comfort. Miller listened, his engineer's mind beginning to understand. The ugly chimney wasn't a mistake. It was brilliant. Every ugly bulge was a heat storage chamber. Every odd curve was a carefully designed smoke channel. The massive size wasn't wasteful. It was necessary thermal mass. The central location meant heat radiated in all directions instead of half of it going through the outer wall. Henrik hadn't built wrong. He'd built right. He'd built better than anyone else. And everyone had been too busy laughing at the ugly chimney to understand what they were seeing. If you're learning something valuable about old building techniques and survival skills, this is the perfect moment to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering forgotten knowledge that kept people alive and comfortable in conditions that would defeat most modern systems. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future stories about the ingenious solutions our ancestors developed. Now let's continue with Henrik's story and see how his innovation spread through the territory. Miller went home and told his wife what he'd seen. Word spread quickly. Within a week, half the settlers in the area had found excuses to visit Henrik's cabin. They wanted to see the ugly chimney. They wanted to feel its warmth. They wanted to understand how it worked. Henrik, never comfortable with attention, patiently explained his design to anyone who asked. He showed them the basic principle. Don't let heat escape until you've extracted everything you can from it. Use mass to store heat, designed for slow release, not immediate consumption. Some settlers immediately wanted to copy his design. Henrik was generous with his knowledge, but he also warned them. The design required precision. The channels had to be the right size. The bends had to be correct. The stonework had to be sound. Building it wrong could result in a chimney that didn't draw properly, that filled your cabin with smoke, that cracked from thermal stress. It wasn't a beginner's project. Several men who considered themselves skilled builders insisted they could handle it. Henrik let them try. The first copycat chimney was built by a settler named Thomas Webb. Webb was confident, experienced, and certain he understood Henrik's design after one visit. He built his version quickly, in less than a week. When he lit his first fire, the cabin filled with smoke. The chimney wouldn't draw. Webb had made the channels too narrow and the bends too sharp. Smoke backed up and poured into the cabin. He had to abandon the fire and open all his windows, letting in the freezing cold. Webb spent the next month tearing out his failed chimney and building a traditional one. He was too embarrassed to ask Henrik where he'd gone wrong. The second attempt was more successful. A German immigrant named Friedrich Hoffmann asked Henrik to actually help him with the design. Hoffmann had some stoneworking experience and understood that precision mattered. Together, they designed a chimney for Hoffmann's cabin, slightly smaller than Henrik's, but following the same principles. Hoffmann worked carefully, checking every dimension, making sure each channel was correct. When he finished and lit his first fire, the chimney drew perfectly. Within a month, Hoffmann was reporting the same results Henrik achieved. Half the firewood, twice the warmth. By the spring of 1877, 3 more cabins in the area featured variations of Henrik's design. Not all were as effective as the original. Some builders compromised, making the mass smaller to save work, or simplifying the channel design. These simplified versions still worked better than traditional straight chimneys, but they didn't achieve the full efficiency of Henrik's carefully engineered system. The lesson was clear. Doing it right required effort and precision. Cutting corners meant cutting performance. The design faced criticism from traditional builders. Some insisted it was dangerous. They claimed the complex channels would clog with creosote, the black tarry substance that accumulated in chimneys from burning wood. A clogged chimney could cause fires or carbon monoxide poisoning. Henrik had an answer for this concern. His system, because it burned wood at high temperatures in a small firebox, actually produced less creosote than traditional fireplaces. The hot, complete combustion left little residue, and the horizontal channels were accessible for cleaning through removable stone panels he'd built into the structure. He could clean his entire chimney system once a year, a task that took about 2 hours. Others claimed the design was impractical, too complicated, too expensive, too time-consuming. A traditional chimney could be built in a few days. Henrik's design took weeks. For settlers in a hurry to get shelter built before winter, that time cost was significant. Henrik didn't argue. He simply pointed out that he used half the firewood of a traditional cabin. A settler who spent extra time building an efficient chimney would save that time many times over by not having to cut, haul, split, and stack as much wood. Over the course of a winter, the time savings in firewood gathering far exceeded the extra time spent on construction. The thermal performance differences became even more apparent during the severe winter of 1877 to 1878. That winter was brutal, with temperatures staying below zero for weeks and multiple blizzards burying the territory in deep snow. Families in traditional cabins burned through their firewood supplies at alarming rates. Some ran out completely and had to burn furniture, fence posts, anything combustible to stay alive. Henrik and the few settlers with efficient chimneys used their firewood reserves at a steady, sustainable pace. They never faced the crisis of running out because they simply didn't need as much. The social dynamics in the settlement began to shift. Henrik, who'd been considered odd and foolish, was now sought out for advice. Settlers planning to build new cabins asked for his help. Those with existing cabins asked if there was any way to retrofit or improve their heating systems. Henrik, characteristically quiet and humble, helped when he could. He never said, "I told you so," or made anyone feel foolish for having doubted him. He just shared what he knew. One of the more interesting developments was the evolution of his design. As more people built variations of Henrik's chimney, improvements and modifications emerged. A settler named Robert McMahon added a small oven chamber into one of the bulges of his chimney mass. The hot smoke passing through the chamber heated the oven, allowing him to bake bread using waste heat that would otherwise just be stored in stone. The oven worked perfectly, maintaining steady baking temperatures for hours. Another builder, a man named Sean O'Connor, incorporated a water heating tank into his chimney mass. The tank, made from copper he'd salvaged from an old still, was wrapped in stone. Water in the tank heated slowly as smoke passed around it, providing warm water for washing and cooking. O'Connor reported that he could heat 20 gallons of water from freezing to near boiling, just from his evening fire, with no extra fuel cost. Henrik himself continued refining his understanding of heat management. He discovered that the position of his firebox, low and on the north side of the stone mass, was more important than he'd initially realized. The smoke entered the channel system while still extremely hot and rose naturally through the serpentine path. If he'd positioned the firebox differently, the draw might not have been as strong. The design worked because it aligned with natural convection patterns. He also experimented with different burning strategies. He found that burning hardwoods like oak or hickory, which were scarce in Wyoming but available through trade, produced longer-lasting heat than the cottonwood and pine that grew locally. The hardwood burned slower and hotter, charging the stone mass more thoroughly. He began keeping a small supply of hardwood for the coldest nights, using local wood for normal conditions. The economic impact of efficient heating extended beyond just firewood savings. In settlements where wood was becoming scarce from overuse, the price of firewood rose dramatically. A cord of wood that cost $2 in 1876 was selling for $5 by 1878. Settlers with efficient chimneys were insulated from these price increases because they simply needed less. Some even began selling their surplus firewood, turning their heating efficiency into actual income. By 1879, Henrik's chimney design had a reputation throughout Wyoming Territory. Travelers stopping at settlements would ask if anyone had built one of those Swedish heat chimneys, as they were coming to be called. Building a Swedish chimney became a mark of sophistication and forward thinking. New settlers arriving in the territory specifically sought out builders who knew how to construct them. The ugly chimney that everyone had mocked 3 years earlier was now desired, copied, and respected. Henrik himself remained modest about his contribution. When people praised his innovation, he always pointed out that he hadn't invented any of the individual principles. Heat storage in mass was ancient knowledge. Masonry heaters existed in Europe, particularly in Russia and Scandinavia, for centuries. What Henrik had done was adapt those principles to the specific needs and materials of the American frontier. He'd created a design that could be built by a single person with local materials, that worked with the wood species available in Wyoming, and that provided maximum efficiency with minimum complexity. This distinction between invention and adaptation is important. Henrik didn't claim to have discovered something new. He claimed to have applied something old in a new context. He'd looked at a problem, the waste of heat in standard American cabins, and applied knowledge from other traditions to solve it. His genius was in synthesis, not pure invention. He combined his foundry experience, which taught him about heat extraction, with his knowledge of Scandinavian heating traditions, and created something appropriate for frontier Wyoming. The technical details of Henrik's design reveal sophisticated understanding. The channel dimensions, 8 inches wide by 6 inches tall, were optimal for his needs. Wider channels would have allowed smoke to move too quickly, reducing heat transfer. Narrower channels risked creosote buildup and poor draw. The height of 6 inches was just enough to allow natural convection to pull smoke through while maintaining maximum surface contact with stone. The width of 8 inches provided adequate cross-sectional area for smoke volume without creating turbulence at the bends. The length of the smoke path, approximately 40 feet of horizontal travel plus the vertical sections, was also carefully considered. Too short and insufficient heat would be extracted. Too long and the smoke would cool too much, potentially causing draft problems or excessive creosote. 40 feet was the sweet spot, long enough to capture most of the heat, but not so long that smoke cooled below the point of efficient flow. These weren't arbitrary dimensions. They were the result of calculation and, in some cases, trial and error during construction. The mass of the stone structure, estimated at 6 to 7 tons, provided enormous thermal storage capacity. Stone has a specific heat capacity of about 0.2 calories per gram per degree Celsius. That massive structure could store tremendous amounts of heat energy. When Henrik burned wood for 3 hours, heating the stone mass to approximately 150 degrees Fahrenheit, the stored energy would radiate slowly over 12 to 15 hours, maintaining cabin comfort through the night and into the next morning. The central location of the chimney mass was crucial for even heat distribution. In a cabin with a fireplace on the wall, heat radiated in a semicircle, with half the heat going through the outer wall to the exterior. Henrik's central mass radiated heat in all directions into the cabin interior. No heat was wasted warming the outdoors. Every bit of stored energy went toward heating the living space. This simple geometric fact doubled the effective heating from the same amount of stored energy. The social impact of Henrik's innovation extended beyond just his immediate neighbors. As word spread, people from other settlements traveled to see his cabin. Some came from as far as 100 miles away, making the journey specifically to study his chimney design. Henrik became an informal teacher, showing visitors the principles, explaining the construction techniques, warning about common mistakes. He never charged for this knowledge. He considered it community benefit, something that improved life for everyone. Several visitors documented his design in drawings and written descriptions. These documents spread even further, reaching settlements in Montana Territory, Colorado, and the Dakotas. Builders who'd never met Henrik constructed chimneys based on second- or third-hand descriptions. Some of these efforts succeeded. Others failed because crucial details were lost in transmission. The written descriptions often omitted the precise dimensions, the importance of stone selection, or the critical details about channel construction. Without these specifics, builders struggled to replicate Henrik's success. This highlights a challenge in transmitting technical knowledge without formal documentation. Henrik's design worked because of careful attention to many small details. Each detail mattered: the size of the channels, the smoothness of the bends, the quality of the mortar, the selection of stones that could withstand thermal cycling without cracking. When any of these details were overlooked or approximated, performance suffered. Some builders, frustrated by poor results, concluded that the Swedish chimney design was overrated. Others persisted, sought more information, made corrections, and eventually achieved success. By 1880, an estimated 50 to 75 cabins across Wyoming Territory featured Henrik-style chimneys. Some were excellent implementations that achieved Henrik's level of performance. Others were mediocre attempts that still heated better than traditional designs, but fell short of the potential. A few were outright failures, built by overconfident builders who thought they understood the principles but missed crucial elements. This variation in results is typical of any technology diffusion. The best results come from those who truly understand the underlying principles, not just the surface-level procedures. Henrik himself continued living in his cabin with its ugly, beautiful chimney. He proved up his homestead claim in 1881, gaining full title to his 160 acres. He married in 1882, a widow named Anna who'd lost her first husband to pneumonia during a brutal winter in a poorly heated cabin. Anna understood immediately the value of Henrik's heating system. She'd lived through winters where inadequate heat was a constant source of misery and danger. Henrik's warm cabin was a revelation to her. They raised 4 children in that cabin. All 4 grew up sleeping comfortably in winter, doing homework by the warm chimney mass. never knowing the misery of cabins where ice formed on the inside walls. When those children grew up and built their own homes, they all incorporated their father's heating principles. The knowledge passed generationally, becoming family tradition, then regional practice. This is the perfect time to remind you that if you're finding value in these stories about forgotten survival wisdom, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. These techniques and stories could literally make the difference between comfort and suffering, between success and failure in challenging conditions. Subscribe now and join a community that values practical knowledge and historical wisdom. Let's continue with how Henrik's legacy evolved over the decades. The winter of 1886 to 1887 provided another dramatic demonstration of heating efficiency differences. That winter set records for sustained cold, with temperatures below zero for 37 consecutive days. Firewood supplies in many settlements ran critically low. Families were forced to burn green wood, fence posts, even parts of outbuildings to stay alive. The smoke from green wood filled cabins with creosote and provided minimal heat. It was a desperate time. Henrik's family, in their cabin with its efficient chimney, used firewood at their normal rate. They never faced a supply crisis. Their carefully stacked firewood, cut during the previous summer and fall, lasted through the entire winter with surplus remaining. Neighbors struggling to find anything to burn asked Henrik how he still had wood. His answer was simple: "I burn less because I waste less." It was a lesson in efficiency versus consumption. You could survive on less if your systems were designed to extract maximum value from resources. This principle extended beyond heating. Settlers with efficient chimneys had more time for other activities because they weren't constantly cutting and hauling wood. They could focus on improving their land, tending livestock, or developing crafts and skills. The time savings accumulated into real economic advantage. A settler who spent half as much time on firewood management had those hours available for productive work. Over months and years, this time advantage translated into better developed farms, more diverse income sources, and higher quality of life. The environmental impact was also notable, though people at the time didn't think in those terms. Areas around settlements with many traditional cabins showed heavy deforestation. Every tree within reasonable hauling distance was cut for firewood. Hillsides were stripped bare. In contrast, areas where settlers used efficient heating systems showed more moderate forest use. Trees were still cut, certainly, but at a sustainable rate. The forest could regenerate between cuttings. This wasn't intentional conservation. It was simply a side effect of not needing as much wood. But the result was the same: less environmental damage. By the early 1890s, as Wyoming moved toward statehood, building codes in some developing towns began to reflect lessons learned from heating efficiency. New construction in town sometimes required minimum chimney mass or included recommendations for heat capture designs. These weren't strict regulations, more like strongly encouraged best practices, but they indicated that Henrik's innovation had moved from individual ingenuity to community standard. Henrik himself, now in his 50s, was recognized as a community elder. People sought his advice on many topics, not just heating. His careful, methodical approach to problem solving, the same approach that had led him to spend a summer studying before building, served him well in all aspects of frontier life. He served on the local school board, helped mediate disputes between neighbors, and continued to share his building knowledge with anyone who asked. The original cabin and its chimney remained in use by Henrik and Anna until 1903. By that time, the cabin was nearly 30 years old. The log walls were still sound, testament to good construction and maintenance. The chimney showed minimal wear. A few stones had cracked from thermal cycling and been replaced, but the overall structure was as solid as the day Henrik finished it. The channels, cleaned annually, remained clear and functional. The system worked as well in its 30th year as it had in its first. In 1903, Henrik built a larger house for his growing family. His children were starting families of their own, and the single-room cabin, even with its excellent heating, was too small for gatherings and extended family. The new house incorporated everything Henrik had learned over the decades. The chimney was even more refined, with improved channel design, better stone selection, and integrated water heating and cooking features. It was the culmination of 3 decades of continuous learning and refinement. The old cabin didn't go to waste. Henrik's oldest son moved into it when he married. The young couple appreciated the reliable heat and low firewood consumption. The cabin served 3 generations of Henrik's family before finally being abandoned in 1932 when the family built modern homes with purchased coal furnaces. Even then, the structure remained sound. The chimney still stood, the channels still clear, a testament to the durability of well-designed, well-built masonry. The legacy of Henrik's ugly chimney extended far beyond his own family and immediate community. As the 20th century progressed and interest in traditional building methods waned, some of the knowledge was lost. Cheap, abundant fossil fuels made efficiency less critical. People stopped building masonry heaters because they could just turn up the thermostat, but the knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It persisted in pockets, among traditionalists, among those who valued self-sufficiency, among builders interested in historical methods. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, there was renewed interest in efficient wood heating. People rediscovered masonry heaters, finding that these old designs often outperformed modern wood stoves. Engineers began studying traditional European heaters and frontier innovations like Henrik's chimney. They confirmed with
modern instruments and calculations what Henrik had known through observation and experience. Long smoke paths, high mass, and careful design could extract 70 to 80% of the heat from burning wood, compared to 30% or less for traditional fireplaces and 50 to 60% for good metal wood stoves. This rediscovery led to a small but dedicated movement of masonry heater builders. Modern masonry heaters, informed by traditional designs like Henrik's, are now recognized as among the most efficient wood-burning heating systems available. They produce less pollution than other wood heating methods because the high-temperature combustion is more complete. They require less wood to heat the same space, and they provide comfortable, steady, radiant heat rather than the blast and chill cycle of conventional wood stoves. The specific story of Henrik Larsson and his ugly chimney was nearly lost. Unlike some frontier innovations that were well documented, Henrik's design existed primarily in oral tradition and actual built examples. As the cabins aged and were abandoned or demolished, the physical evidence disappeared. The story might have been completely forgotten except for one thing. In 1948, a historical society in Wyoming conducted interviews with old-timers who remembered the early settlement days. Henrik's daughter, then in her 60s, was interviewed. She told the story of her father's chimney, how everyone mocked it, how it proved itself, how it changed building practices in the territory. That interview, preserved in the Wyoming State Archives, kept the story alive. Researchers studying frontier building methods found the interview in the 1980s. They tracked down the location of Henrik's original cabin, which by then was just a depression in the ground with scattered stones. But the chimney's foundation stones were still there, arranged in the distinctive pattern of Henrik's design. The researchers mapped the site, documented what remained, and included Henrik's story in their publications about frontier heating methods. Today, a historical marker stands near the site of Henrik's original cabin. It tells the basic story: Swedish immigrant, innovative chimney design, heating efficiency. But like most historical markers, it can only hint at the full story. It can't capture the mockery Henrik endured, the careful study and planning that went into his design, the cold nights when his neighbors shivered while he stayed warm, the gradual spread of his innovation through the territory, or the decades of comfortable living his family enjoyed in their well-heated cabin.
The broader lesson from Henrik's story goes beyond just chimney design. It's about the value of understanding principles rather than just following tradition. Everyone in Wyoming Territory knew how to build a cabin. They followed the patterns they'd learned, doing what everyone else did. Henrik understood why those patterns worked, and, more importantly, where they failed. He wasn't bound by tradition. He was guided by understanding. That understanding allowed him to innovate, to create something better, even if it looked ugly to those who didn't comprehend what they were seeing. It's also a story about patience and planning. Henrik spent an entire summer observing and designing before he built. His neighbors thought he was wasting time. In reality, he was investing time in thinking, ensuring that when he did build, he built right. That upfront investment paid dividends for decades. It's the opposite of the rush to immediate action that characterized many frontier stories. Sometimes the best action is to pause, study, and plan. The mockery Henrik endured is instructive too. Innovation often looks foolish to those who don't understand it. The ugly chimney seemed like a mistake because it violated accepted norms. It didn't look like what a chimney should look like. People judged it by appearance, not by function. Only when the function proved itself did opinions change. This pattern repeats throughout history. True innovation often faces skepticism or ridicule before eventual acceptance. Henrik's willingness to share his knowledge freely is also noteworthy. He could have kept his design secret, maintaining a competitive advantage. Some might have even paid him to build chimneys for them, creating a business opportunity. Instead, he gave the knowledge away to anyone who asked. He helped neighbors, answered questions, warned about pitfalls. His generosity ensured that the innovation spread, that more families benefited, that the community as a whole became more resilient. This reflects a frontier ethic of mutual aid, an understanding that everyone's survival was interconnected. The variation in success rates among those who copied Henrik's design teaches another lesson. Technical knowledge transfer is difficult. Seeing something work doesn't automatically tell you how to replicate it. The details matter. Precision matters. Understanding the underlying principles matters. Some builders succeeded because they took the time to truly understand what Henrik had done and why. Others failed because they thought it looked simple enough to copy without deep understanding. Surface-level imitation often fails. True mastery requires comprehension. The economic implications of heating efficiency were substantial. At a time when cash was scarce on the frontier and most wealth was in labor and time, anything that saved labor was tremendously valuable. Henrik's chimney saved dozens of hours per winter in firewood gathering. Those hours had real economic value. A settler could spend that time improving his land, caring for livestock, or developing a trade. Over years, this time savings could mean the difference between a marginal operation and a thriving one. The environmental sustainability angle, though not consciously pursued at the time, is relevant to modern concerns. Using less wood meant less forest destruction. Today, as we face climate change and resource depletion, the principle of extracting maximum value from resources is more important than ever. Henrik's chimney was sustainable not by intention, but by design. It worked with resources efficiently, taking what was needed but not more. That's a principle worth recovering in our wasteful modern age. The story also illustrates the importance of appropriate technology. Henrik's design was sophisticated but buildable with frontier tools and materials. It didn't require manufactured components, specialized skills, or substantial capital. A motivated individual could build it with stone, clay, and muscle power. This accessibility was crucial for widespread adoption. Technologies that require extensive infrastructure or specialized inputs can't spread easily on the frontier. Appropriate technology matches local capabilities and resources. The multi-generational impact of Henrik's innovation shows how individual ingenuity can compound over time. Henrik built one chimney, His direct teaching influenced maybe 20 to 30 builders. Those builders influenced others. Within a generation, hundreds of families benefited. Some estimates suggest that thousands of people across the Mountain West experienced better living conditions because of heating efficiency improvements that traced back, in whole or in part, to Henrik's example. One man, one summer of careful thought, one ugly chimney. The ripples spread far beyond what Henrik could have imagined. Modern masonry heater builders now recognize Henrik's design as a significant example of American heater innovation. While European masonry heaters were generally more refined in appearance, American frontier heaters, like Henrik's, prioritized function, efficiency, and buildability with available materials. They represent a distinct tradition of practical innovation under resource constraints. Today's builders study these historical examples, learning from frontier problem-solving even as they incorporate modern materials and techniques. Henrik Larsson died in 1921 at the age of 83. He lived long enough to see Wyoming become a state, to see automobiles replace horses, to see electric lights replace oil lamps. But he never saw central heating replace his beloved masonry heater. To the end of his life, he believed in the superiority of radiant heat from stone mass over forced air from furnaces. His children and grandchildren, even those who moved to modern houses with modern heating, remembered the comfort of growing up in cabins heated by his designs. None of them ever forgot the warmth. Anna Larsson outlived her husband by 7 years. In her final interview, given when she was 81 years old, she was asked what she remembered most fondly about her life with Henrik. Her answer was simple: "I was never cold in winter. In my first marriage, I was always cold. Henrik's house was warm. That matters more than people understand." It was a profound statement. Comfort, warmth, the security of knowing you won't freeze. These basic needs shaped frontier life in ways modern people rarely consider. Henrik's ugly chimney provided those needs reliably for decades. The site of Henrik's cabin is on private ranch land now, but the family who owns it has preserved the historical marker and allows occasional visitors. The foundation stones, including the distinctive remains of the central chimney base, are still visible, slowly being reclaimed by grass and sagebrush. It's a quiet place, windswept and peaceful, with distant views of the mountains that drew Henrik west in 1876. Standing there, knowing the story, you can imagine the smoke rising from that central chimney, steady and strong, on winter nights 150 years ago. You can imagine neighbors trudging through snow to visit, seeking warmth and wondering how that ugly chimney could possibly work so well. The story of Henrik's chimney is ultimately a story about seeing what others miss, about having the courage to build differently despite mockery, about the patience to design carefully before acting, and about the generosity to share knowledge freely. These qualities, independence of thought, careful planning, practical skill, and community-mindedness, are the qualities that built the American frontier. They're qualities worth remembering and emulating. In our modern world of abundant energy and automated heating, it's easy to forget the ingenuity required to stay warm with only wood and stone. It's easy to dismiss frontier building methods as primitive or outdated. But Henrik's ugly chimney teaches us that our ancestors were often far more sophisticated than we give them credit for. They understood principles of thermodynamics, heat transfer, and energy efficiency, even if they didn't use those terms. They solved problems with elegant simplicity, with available materials, with designs that worked reliably for generations. The next time you see an old structure that looks odd or impractical, consider that you might be looking at innovation, not ignorance. Consider that there might be sophisticated reasoning behind what appears crude. Consider that the builders might have understood something about their environment, their materials, and their needs that isn't immediately obvious to modern eyes. Ugly can be beautiful. Unconventional can be brilliant. And the simplest materials, stone and clay and fire, in the hands of someone who truly understands them, can create comfort and security that lasts for generations. Henrik Larsson built an ugly chimney in 1876. Everyone mocked it. Then winter came, and in the warmth of that rough stone mass, in the efficiency of those serpentine channels, in the radiant comfort that lasted through long, cold nights, the ugly chimney revealed its true beauty. It was the beauty of function, the beauty of understanding, the beauty of design that works exactly as intended. The settlers who'd laughed learned to appreciate what they'd first ridiculed, and those who learned from Henrik spread that appreciation and that knowledge throughout the territory and beyond. The legacy endures. In masonry heaters built today, in the renewed interest in efficient wood heating, in the growing understanding that old methods often contain wisdom we've forgotten, Henrik's ugly chimney stands as a reminder that innovation doesn't always look impressive at first glance, that the best solutions often come from understanding principles deeply, and that one person's careful thought and patient work can improve life for generations to come. That's not just a story about heating a cabin. It's a story about how progress actually happens, one ugly, brilliant, carefully built chimney at a time.